Hello everyone and welcome to this bonus episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast, the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. And this evening I'd like to draw on some of the conversations I've had with enthusiasts from North America who are searching for ancestors in England. I work in a tiny bookshop in a market town in the middle of England, and some of the pleasures that come out of that are the occasions when American visitors drop into the shop and talk about their family history excursions on this side of the Atlantic. And I found that there are some common themes that keep cropping up. So I thought it might be worthwhile talking through those issues in an extra episode of the podcast. Now, this additional podcast does not wreck our regular schedule. I will still post a new Talk Genealogy podcast on the third day of each month. You'll know that I always preface my talks by reminding you that I am neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast like you, who has spent more than 50 years digging up his family tree. And these podcasts are really no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons that I've learnt along the way. And this evening, that limitation is especially relevant. Why? Well, because I've never sat at a study desk in the middle of America and tried to research my family tree from that end of the telescope. So hey, what do I know about it? And I'm very much aware that the American audience is not short of podcasts about genealogy. They're all over the place. But since the advice that I'm offering here has been drawn directly from the conversations I've had with family history fans in my shop, I guess it might come from a different starting point. I was going to say a different focus, but that would be taking the telescope just an inch too far. My presentation is less than 4,000 words long. Any longer and you wouldn't be listening in any case. Now, obviously, in 4,000 words, I'm going to make sweeping generalisations, and yes, there will be scores of exceptions to what I say, but I hope you'll feel able to trust the general thrust of the advice which I'm offering. Now, I'm going to start halfway down the track, say, who wants to start at the beginning? So I'm assuming that you are already using the popular family history search sites. Regular listeners will know that I'm always reluctant to spend money on family history work, so I'm not going to recommend any particular site. Just, hey, take care of your pocket, yeah? The wolves are out there. I'm also taking it that you will have browsed through some of the guidebooks and the popular books on family history. I'm always getting told off for mentioning the older books. That's because they've been with me a long time. But there are several good books in the bookstores today. For example, You Can Trust Anything, written by David Hay. So I hope I'm getting the point across that this talk isn't aimed at the raw beginner. Rather, I want to share some ideas with folk who've been at it long enough to feel that perhaps it's not all coming together like it probably should do. Now that's a feeling I know plenty about. The subjects I'm going to be talking about are pretty broad, so it's not practical to take you through them in detail. If you like, I'm going to suggest things that I think you should look at, the areas of study that you should get yourself familiar with, and then I'll leave you to work through them as much or as little as you wish. But I know that I could not have completed my genealogical research without having these techniques to hand. You know, I can hear myself, I'm beginning to lecture, so we better move on. I'm going to start with one of the most useful steers that I think I could offer. It is one of the easiest ways for people unfamiliar with English genealogy to get things wrong. A particular difference between the English and the American researcher is, I've found, their different perceptions of space and distance. So often I read through family trees where links are made between, say, a Cheshire lass and a Kentish lad, with no thought that perhaps this needs a special explanation. England is a small country, but it was even smaller in days gone by. I've mentioned in previous episodes that before our forefathers moved from the country to the towns, folks usually stayed on home ground, I say within the next but one parish. Now, I'm sure it can be tempting when an internet search throws up a William Cartwright of the right age, 80 miles from a girl with the right name. But you know, that is very unlikely to be the right William Cartwright. And I cannot emphasize this enough. You cannot say that it must be him because the search has thrown up no one else. You know, you've probably already read about sound research practices in the guidebook, so let's be wary of being tempted away from that good and honourable path. Now, there's always a tension in research between preparation, picking up the background, and getting on with it, which is why whenever I go to a conference, I never listen to the first 10 minutes of any session. But when you're looking for ancestors in England, the background is like the road map. So what I'm going to say is this: take a brief look at the background, get the drift of the script, then go on to the more productive stuff if you like, and come back for a deeper look at the background when you miss it. Now that's not sensible, it's not the best way of doing it, but hey, it is the way that we all go. Now I'd like you to get a hand on the nature of English genealogy and the genealogical history of the country. By English genealogy, I mean to say migration, reproductive norms, the shape of families, the class structure, the makeup of societies and communities. I suppose I mean a social profile. Like you, I've come across several hundred grandparents, and mine all have one thing in common. They all knew their place. My grandmother shared a secret. Her father grew up on the wrong side of the Thames. Centuries before, Matilda wouldn't marry her duke because he was a bastard. Two women who had no doubt about their place in the scheme of things, and there are dozens of examples from the generations between them. And then there is the genealogical history of England, the milestones that have changed the way that we look at the evidence. Without a knowledge of these two aspects, you're going to be searching blindfold, which is okay because you will still bump into dead ancestors. Sure enough, but it's not the best way of doing it. I'll tell you what, let's press on. Let's talk about what we can do rather than what we should know. But remember, we do need to come back to these boring subjects later on. The strategy which I recommend to English researchers is to build on and strengthen the oral and the family traditions for the past 100 years. Then draw on the census to carry us back through Victorian times. Again, strengthening and reinforcing, often correcting what it tells us. Hopefully we'll then find the village or the knot of villages where a particular branch of our family tree was embedded prior to the Industrial Revolution, and hopefully this will take us back to the commencement of the Parish Registers, when we will need to identify gateway ancestors, and you will, who will help us back to medieval times. Now the American researcher needs to recognise at what stage his emigrant ties in with this thread. Of course, what's an emigrant to me is an immigrant to you. But try and keep that sequence in mind. Hey, it would make more sense, wouldn't it, if we knew the background to English genealogy, but we're going to wait for later. With that in mind, there are some important websites that you may want to befriend. The Family History Society for the county in question, once you've established some links with that part of the country. You'll need to work out whether you want to join. I tend to do so because these groups are always short of funds but full of ideas on how to spend it. But look at their online facilities and also their web shop. Here you'll find out about the transcripts that are available, the current and past research work, particular issues relating to the area, a great fire, naval impressment or an industrial disease. But most important, you'll be in touch with people in the know. They do vary, but they are all run by enthusiasts, and who, by the way, never ask them to do free research for you. Some will, and you'll be surprised by their generosity, but they really are busy enough. If you want to browse a good Family History Society site, I would look at Cambridgeshire, the one that I use. In the same way, some parishes have their local history groups. For a really good one, search for the Bingham site in Nottingham. I will leave links on the show notes for tonight's episode, but they should Google up quite nicely in any case. The other essential sites spring from our old Public Records Office. They are the National Archives, British History Online, and the History of Parliament. If you are serious about ancestor hunting in England, you really do need to know your way around these sites so that you know what they've got and where to find it, and so you can navigate them for a quick check. Again, I will offer links on the show notes. Now, following on from those sites, you may want to look at the sites for the County Records Office. Now, the County Records Officers are good, they provide a good service, but you know, their websites are generally not too wonderful. In fact, they're pretty rubbish. So, hey ho, you're using the popular family history search site that you've been using at home for some time, no doubt, and now you're bolstering that resource with a good knowledge of the different Family History Society sites by county and the 3 sites from the National Archives. But we've now got to that stage where we really have got to look at the background to our work so we can make the best use of those sources. Let's have 20 seconds of music before we move on to the second half of the podcast. Can I remind you that the show notes for this and previous episodes can be found on the website talkgenealogy.wordpress.com. That website includes a full bibliography of the books mentioned in the series and of course a complete listing of the episodes. You'll also find a wordy blog of my very occasional thoughts. In the second part of this podcast, I'm going to account for the genealogical history of England, the nature of English genealogy, before concluding with a route map of things to take forward. Okay, genealogy in England starts afresh with the Norman conquest of 1066. Oh dear, I can hear all sorts of people complaining and challenging that, but here we go. 1066 brought new ruling families, new landholders, and a new written language. The Normans introduced new laws. Now, many names of the very first new families were written on what is called the Battle Abbey roll. That was reputedly a list of knights who fought at the Battle of Hastings with William the Conqueror. Now, it's gone missing, but several books have been written about it with transcripts, but it does not have a good reputation for being an accurate record of the knights who fought at the battle. I've always looked upon it as a fairly good record of the leading families in the 1 or 2 centuries following the conquest. The Normans took the place over, and 20 years after Hastings, this new genealogical landscape was detailed in the Domesday Book, where each of the landholding families were listed. Now, I tend to divide the history of genealogy in England into 3 periods: the medieval period, the Tudor and Stuart periods, but let's extend that by 100 years to the start of the Industrial Revolution, and then the modern period. My regular listeners will be familiar with the picture which I try to paint of our generation reaching back through the sources of the modern and the middle periods, while the footprints of our ancestors are reaching forward in the sources from the early periods, and it's our job to try and connect those 2 adventures. Now, during the early period, evidence survives of more or less successful attempts to apply national and properly managed taxation. These developments led us to the pipe rolls and the lay subsidies with names and locations of the taxpayers. Now, if you go to the website, you'll see that we've already done a podcast on the pipe rolls. The lay subsidies were taxations imposed on the lay population, the general population that is, usually for a specific purpose, usually a war. Now, in some cases, muster rolls also survive from this period. and from the same time a growing and regular system for settling civil disputes have left us with good legal records. So the primary sources from this early period are exchequer and legal. You may feel that this includes the general class of the population, and to a certain extent that's right. But remember that the labouring class formed a smaller portion of the population at the time. As I've said elsewhere, they were a smaller portion of a smaller population. So this brings us on to Tutor Periods, when, as far as genealogy is concerned, a number of very useful things were developing side by side. One of the most important things was the practice of writing a will became more prevalent, and any Tudor will is a very important source for English genealogy. I made it the subject of my first podcast. That's how important I think it is. Also, with the decline of the manorial courts, the parish vestry became more active, with responsibility for managing various parochial affairs. Now, the amount of records that survive from the vestry proceedings varies from parish to parish, and they've been stored until recently in the parish chest. And of course, the most important occupants of the parish chest were the new parish registers of baptisms, marriages and deaths. Now, the history books tell us that these should date from 1538, although the commencement date is very irregular, as I'm sure you've found out. You know, I don't think there can be a source in English genealogy that has the same romance as the parish registers. The instructions from Thomas Cromwell that it should be kept in a sound coffer with separate keys, and that every soul in the parish should be entered onto its pages at the times of their hatch, match and dispatch. It's the stuff of history. And this takes us into Stuart times, when we benefit from the work of William Dugdale and his contemporaries, who worked very hard at producing reliable what's called Herald's Visitations, which is the report of a touring herald who went around the country asking people to verify their rights to coats of arms, and they produced family trees to justify this. Again, we have done an early podcast on the works of the Herald's Visitations, which I recommend you look at. The other two important dates from this period, as far as genealogy is concerned, is the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XIV in 1685. This put the Protestant population in France at risk, and nearly 500,000 French citizens fled the country. Many came to England as what we know as the Huguenot migration. And that had a great effect, not only in terms of intermarriage, but also in the different records and registers which they kept. And then in 1753 we have Hardwick's Marriage Act, which outlawed unlicensed marriages, the Fleet marriages, which some people say accounted for a third of marriages in the 17th century, although I'm not too sure of that myself. So those two events bring us into what I call the modern times, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, which my history teacher always told me began in 1760. This saw the migration of people from rural areas into the towns and sometimes into the cities. And with that great movement, civil registration of births, deaths and marriages began in 1837. And then from 1841 we have the census returns with names of our ancestors every 10 years. Now, there we are. That's a fair old chunk of English history delivered in less than 500 words. And I would encourage you to get familiar with those developments over the centuries. Let's look at why it's important to do that, even in these days of Google and index transcriptions on the net. Yes, search engines are very useful for delivering sometimes very obscure documents to our screen. But we need to understand not only what those documents are, but what documents and sources the search hasn't thrown up. What is missing, so that we can carry on looking for them. And of course, we need to understand the status and credibility of the records which the internet search has produced. Okay, we've looked at the sources of historical evidence. What is the picture that they produce? What can we make of those snippets of information? Now, I've already spoken about migration during the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution, and they help to paint part of a picture of the population. But as you go further back in your family tree, you will need to establish a social profile. What do I mean by that? Well, fundamentally, their class and their religion. Now, people will build up a full social profile, adding marriage patterns, fertility, morbidity, and much else. But when you're talking about a social profile for genealogy, the class and religion are the thick end of it. After the conquest, the Normans were top dogs, we know that. Now, generally speaking, the English way was to devolve property to the primary heir, rather than dividing it up into small parcels and giving a small parcel to each child. Now, as Dorothy L. Sayers once put it, this is very unfair to the children, but very fair to the property, because it stays in one body. So you may think, by the time we get to the 5th and 6th daughter, she is pretty much ready to fall off the far end of the family tree, and certainly that is the end of the family that is likely to marry into a lower class, as we shall see later. But as these major families expanded, so we get increasing evidence of economic alliances through marriage, so that a daughter may come to the altar with the odd English manor or two in her pocket. Out of all this, the class structure which we recognise today emerged. At the top are the royals and the aristocracy, the power brokers. Beneath them is the knightly class. Now, these two classes are important for who they are rather than what they did, and it was in many people's interest to try and show that they were descended from this ruling class, and that led to many corrupt family trees being promulgated. Then came the gentlemen. Originally, the College of Arms had tried to restrict that term to those entitled to bear arms, but it was generally accepted that a gentleman was someone who did not work with his hands. To call yourself a gentleman was not a matter of courtesy or politeness, it was quite a specific description of your station in life. Now, in the same class was the yeoman. Again, definition can be difficult, but if you take it to be either the major farmer in a parish or someone of that status, you won't be far wrong. And then underneath them came the skilled and the mercantile class, and then the labouring poor. But these classes were not watertight, and there was always a good bit of social mobility. Now, when you get back to an ancestral family before, say, 1750, you really do need to establish their class. Not only will that show you how they lived, but it will allow you to test the credibility of any evidence that you're collecting about them. Is it consistent with their standing? Now, please allow me to offer an example of something I'm currently working on. I'm always on the lookout for gateway ancestors. By that I mean those grandparents with sufficient standing or fortune, by which I mean luckiness, that their history has been recorded and can ferry us back to much earlier times. So they are a gateway to the past. Now, researching an old cricket match, please, you don't want to know why, I came across an entry in an old Herald's Visitation report that connected a posh family in the parish with what might be a collateral branch of my family in the same village. Now, I haven't been able to tie down the relationship except to ascertain that it is not direct descent, but I now know that that branch of the family was of a sufficient class that was able to marry into the knightly class. So I know it's a promising line to work on, and I know that because I've been able to build the beginnings, no more at this stage, of a social profile. So it is this background knowledge that is guiding the direction of my work. The second feature that you need to be aware of is the growth of nonconformity in the parishes. Here, migration might be important, but also a general restlessness with the dominant religion. Now, this is important. It tells you about the person, directs you towards different sources of information, especially in baptism and burial, and also it may affect marrying patterns. However, when we get back to Stuart and Tudor times, this religion becomes essential. You really do need to know if your ancestor was for the old religion or the new religion, because this really did define people. It showed how they lived, where they left their footprint, and what their family ties were. And it will lead you to understand their wills and transfers of land, abstention from office, and fines for not attending church, and much, much more. Again, an example from my own file, and I don't want to keep using my own work, but the examples are relevant. One of my grandparents in Tudor times followed a nonconformist religion. He was accused of being a wizard, a very perilous position to be in at that time. He was charged with casting horoscopes. Now, he managed to, if you like, get away with it. But sometime later, the grave of his colleague was dug up and the body disinterred by religious opponents in the middle of the night. Now, these were very dangerous times as regards religion, and we need to be able to take account of that. Okay, let's take a look at where we've got to. I think it's important that we have a grasp of the landscape of genealogy at the time of the records that we're consulting. I said there might be medieval, Tudor and Stuart, or modern times. Why? Because we need to know what records we've missed, and we need to know the status and any reservations about those records that have shown up. And when we interpret the evidence from those records, we need to have an understanding of the social profile, even if that is no more than class and religion. The overall strategy that I suggested was to use oral and family tradition to take us back 100 years and then hitch a ride on the census returns. We need to validate everything we pick up from oral, family and census evidence. Remember, the census is really oral history one step removed. It's what our family told the enumerators, and in my case, so why not in yours, they told fibs. The 1851 census is especially important in England because it gives places of birth, perhaps 1 or 2 generations into the Industrial Revolution. Once in the rural community, the Parish Registers and the vestry records will hopefully whistle us back to the early Stuart and Tudor times. Then, using our knowledge of the sources available at the period, we look for a gateway ancestor or ancestors to take us back to early times. And I gave an example of how social profiling can help in that. I've suggested some essential websites for you to familiarise yourselves with. The site of the County Family History Society, and probably a local history site if there is one, and the 3 sites from the National Archives. That's the National Archives, British History Online, and the History of Parliament. Get to know those so well that you can dip in and out of them without a second thought. Now, okay, here's a secret. I have offered you the thorough and most intricate route to solving your family tree in England. I've done this because this is the podcast for the genealogist with too much time on their hands. But the payoff is worth it. Do genealogy thoroughly, and through understanding your ancestors, you'll get to know them. Oh, and one last word of advice. Your family story is interesting to you and 1 or 2 others. But do watch out for that glazed look when you begin to tell it to other people. Thank you for listening to this extra episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast. Please get in touch if you've any thoughts or comments or a family history story that you'd like to tell. Can I remind you that the show notes for tonight's episode can be found on talkgenealogy.wordpress.com. And as always, I'll be posting another podcast at 7:30 p.m. UK time on the third day of each month. My thanks to Freeze Effects for the music, Emily Brooks for the voiceover, but most of all, thank you for listening. Good night. Hi, this one's a quick 30-second update for followers of my Talk Genealogy podcast, with a look at the reshaped website. On the front page, tabs for the show notes of the recent episodes are clearly displayed. There are links to the audio podcasts, of course. And now additional tabs for two new pages. The bibliography brings together the details of all the books mentioned into one place. Several are mentioned in more than one episode. And there's a page for me to share particular thoughts of the moment about genealogy. This one concerns the Place Name Society and Frank Stenton. My thanks to everyone whose comments led to these improvements. It's nice to know that you're there and joining in. The web address is unchanged, talkgenealogy.wordpress.com. Our forthcoming episodes, by the way, are the 3rd of March, The Vicissitudes of Families, drawing on the work of Bernard Burke. And the 3rd of April, we'll have 30 minutes on working with the medieval pipe rolls. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll be there to catch them.
Went down, but great loss of life. Then on the Titanic, suddenly on the screen appears this elderly lady in her 80s or thereabouts. It was the daughter of my great aunt, and both the mother and the father died, and they somehow or the other the child was put on something and kept afloat, whether it was done by them or however, but she survived. She was one of the very few children that did survive. It was exciting to see someone I just missed out on meeting, because she died in the 90s, I think, and suddenly to see her on screen and hear her talking about this thing that she remembered was not so much sad as quite exciting.